Every spring, when there are no flocks of birds in the sky, Chip takes his family to the wetlands to collect bird eggs. The family boards their small boat together and rows to their destination. Upon landing, their first task is to place some dry hay in a bucket. Then each person takes a bucket and starts searching for bird nests. However, today they are out of luck, as the high tide blocks their path, and they must return along the river. The Alaskan tundra hides many rare treasures. Suddenly, Timok finds a sturgeon arrowhead with a small hole at the end, now clogged with mud. Ancient people would tie a fishing line to this end to catch sturgeon. The barbs on the arrowhead firmly hook the prey. The arrowhead, long buried and slightly corroded, will be preserved at home by applying a layer of clear glue to seal its surface, making it a valuable collectible. Back on the boat, they head to another area where many seagulls are perched near nests, indicating plenty of eggs. Chip finds a nest with 4 eggs, likely goose eggs. His daughters also make their own finds. Kooten, the youngest, has a close call with attacking seagulls after disturbing a nest. They test the collected eggs by placing them in water. Those that sink are freshly laid. Chip finds another nest with large goose eggs. This activity is much like an Easter egg hunt for the family, full of various surprises. After the winter thaw, the upstream flow brings many items to the wetlands, sometimes even fossils. There's always a slight risk, as cotton almost gets stuck in the mud, which smells terrible and can leave a person stinking for days. The egg collecting continues. A nest with only 3 large eggs suggests more will be laid soon. Smaller nests usually contain seagull eggs. This year's yield is less than last year's 200 plus. Perhaps they came too early. At sunset, Chip cooks the eggs wrapped in damp grass by the campfire, creating a deliciously soft and sweet dish, richer in protein than beef. For a unique flavor, they sprinkle some chili powder on the eggs. In the morning, Chip and his eldest son, Doug, see a herd of deer near their camp. They delay their approach until the deer swim across the river. Doug uses his shotgun effectively, ensuring a hit. Chip also bags a deer. They tie the game to the sides of their boat and clean the animals in the river, saving time and effort compared to land hunting, without risking harm to other reindeer. After cleaning, they return to camp with their catch. Agnes and the daughters await on the shore, eager for the meal. The first parts of the reindeer they consume are the heart and tongue, simply cooked with onions and water. As they enjoy their meal against the setting sun, they appreciate their hard but rewarding and adventurous lifestyle. A few days later, a small boat quickly approached them. It was Doug, Chip's eldest son, bringing 3 seals to the family. Seals are a precious resource throughout Alaska, and only local indigenous people have the right to hunt them. They are also a major source of fat during the winter. Living in the coastal town of Deering, 50 kilometers away, Doug is skilled at hunting such prey. Agnes, along with her daughters, quickly sharpened their ulu knives. They would hang the lean meat to dry and store it, while the fat was cleaned and rendered into oil. Seals may look small, but their fat layer is thicker than that of a 300-pound pig. These 3 seals could yield about 40 gallons of oil. Chip and Doug came over as well. Since Chip is not indigenous, he does not have the right to process the seals. Rendering the oil also requires a lot of firewood, which naturally fell to him to collect. The 2 then headed out in their boat to gather driftwood along the riverbanks. This spring's floods hadn't brought much wood, so they had to search along the shore. They soon found a dry log, with one chopping with an axe and the other sawing with a chainsaw. The tree was dry enough to use immediately. Back at camp, Agnes and Timok continued to process the seal oil. Once they started, they had to process all the fat at once to prevent it from leaking through any gaps. Chip and Doug found another dry log, with the axe clearing branches and the chainsaw cutting it to length. Their ancestors had lived this way for thousands of years, obtaining everything they needed from the sea and land. This lifestyle could sustain someone comfortably anywhere in Alaska. The men returned to camp with a boat full of firewood. Agnes had nearly finished processing the seals, and now they needed to clean and render the oil. Chip took advantage of the calm weather to take Doug back home. The 50-kilometer journey each way would take about 5 to 6 hours. With nothing much to offer in return, they gave Doug half a bucket of collected bird eggs. After saying goodbye to Doug, they started boiling the fat. 5 large barrels of it, enough to last them a good while. Meanwhile, Agnes taught Carol how to handle seal skin. They used a wooden frame to stretch the skin, threading ropes through the edges and tying them to the frame. The tension had to be just right to avoid uneven thickness in the skin. The drying process would take about 4 to 5 days until the seal skin was hard and set. If there was time later, Agnes planned to make vests or boots, or even decorative white canvases from it. These could be traded for essential supplies like gasoline, bullets, and food. After several days of continuous work, it was time to reward themselves. This summer, they not only had dried deer meat, but also seal oil. They prepared a meal of reindeer meat with seal oil, supplemented with apples and onions for a balanced, healthy, and tasty dish. Tomorrow, they would start their journey back to Norvik, bringing all the food they had gathered to prepare for the harsh winter. When the snow began to melt, the Hailstone family arrived in Kivalliq to hunt and fish. Early in the morning, Chip, eager to hunt, dragged his sled out, watching the geese flying joyfully in the sky, wishing he could shoot one down. Unlike before, today Chip had 2 helpers, his eldest son Doug, and T-Mac's boyfriend Kevin, both from the neighboring village of Deering. They bundled some bushes together, laid some straw, and covered it with a large white cloth to create a bird hunting blind. Geese gradually landed in the nearby clearing, and everyone checked their weapons. Chip loaded his antique shotgun, and they mimicked the calls of the geese to attract them. This method didn't work well on pairs, but it was effective in luring solitary geese. A surprisingly successful tactic. A lone swan circled overhead, and Chip, with his antique, prepared to shoot but missed, the gun proving ineffective at that distance. To increase their hunting range and success, the 3 men set up another blind. Kevin, a native of the area, was experienced in hunting, but his first 2 shots missed. Relying on better equipment, within minutes, Kevin successfully shot a large goose with his scoped .22 caliber rifle. T-Mac was responsible for retrieving the game. This was their first goose of the year, weighing about 7 or 8 pounds. Kevin placed it in an open area, propping its head with a stick to make its calls more realistic. Using the goose as a decoy, they quickly attracted 2 more. The 2 men stood up and fired, hitting one unlucky goose that was wounded and couldn't fly away. They simply needed to stretch its neck, adding another decoy to their setup. Later, Chip and Agnes joined them, pleased to hear that both geese were caught by their son-in-law, whom Chip was growing increasingly fond of. They returned to their own blind to continue hunting. Before long, a goose landed on the lake, and they waited, using the live decoy to attract others. Soon, 3 more geese flew towards them. This time, it was Chip's turn. Whether by luck or fluke, he managed to shoot one down, to the cheers of Agnes and the incredulous looks from the young men. By evening, the young men had caught 3 geese each, and Chip won, totaling 7 Canada geese, enough for a hearty meal for the family. They started back to camp with their game, plucking the geese while they were still warm. In a few hours, it would be T-Mac's birthday, named after the geese that returned during his birth, which means goose in Eskimo language. Next came the exciting part of cooking. High-quality ingredients often only require simple cooking, paired with seal oil for a delicious meal. Lean but not dry, oily but not greasy, the family roasted the goose by the campfire, enjoying a brief respite after a busy day. As the temperature rose and the snow on the ground lessened, Chip and Agnes seized the last days of winter to hunt reindeer for their spring and summer food supply. They rode their snowmobile across the river in front of the camp, where a large group of reindeer was running on the hillside. For residents of Alaska, obtaining meat doesn't require a trip to the supermarket. The wilderness provides everything they need. Shedding their gloves and tossing aside their glasses, they pulled the trigger to secure their desired meat. Watching the game fall, they rode their snowmobiles to the site to quickly process the catch. With the snow soon to melt completely, snowmobiles would soon be out of use. They aimed to catch a few more reindeer to secure enough food for the summer. On their way home, they encountered another group of reindeer, conveniently saving them the effort of searching. Chip drove the snowmobile to the side of the herd, targeting the adult males, as most females at this time were likely with calves. Agnes pulled the trigger again and successfully made the shot. Seeing the prey down, they rode to collect their game, quickly gutting it and loading it onto the sled. The 2 reindeer meant they wouldn't have to rely solely on hunting birds for meat. In the morning, the snow was still firm, but by afternoon, it began to show signs of melting. The sled, heavy with 2 reindeer, posed a challenge, especially with the river in front of the camp where the ice was getting thinner by the day. Chip and Agnes started to cross the river, but soon their sled fell into the water. Chip revved the engine, trying to pull the sled out, but the heavy load made it difficult. The sled and its load sank into the river, prompting T-Mick, who was waiting on the other side, to shout for her brother. He came with another snowmobile to help, and they slowly dragged the vehicle back onto the ice. Just as they were about to reach the bank, the ice under Chip cracked, dropping him and the vehicle back into the water. Though it was spring, the river water was still very cold. With the previous experience in mind, they cautiously removed the sled first, then dragged up the snowmobile, and finally, the day's catch of 2 reindeer. Wet and cold, Chip and Agnes hurried to warm up and change into dry clothes to avoid hypothermia. After changing, they checked the snowmobile's condition. Water had entered the exhaust, but not the engine. Chip turned the snowmobile over. It still started, indicating no serious damage. The next day, the Hailstone family packed up their camp. With the snow melting quickly and the flood season approaching, their current location would soon be underwater. They moved their tents to higher ground. Agnes and her daughters packed the items to be moved, while Chip collected firewood. After the flood, all the driftwood in the area would be washed away. He went to the coast where the waves had brought in plenty of usable wood, and quickly cut enough with his chainsaw to fill a sled, then hurried back to camp. Every minute later increased the risk on the river. After half a day's effort, they successfully moved their tent to higher ground. From here, they could avoid the flood and have a view of the surrounding game. A herd of reindeer grazed nearby. Having secured 2 reindeer, Chip and Agnes quietly watched the herd, content with their supply. As the temperature continued to rise, they planned to butcher and dry the reindeer meat, which could be stored for a long time, used as travel provisions, or eaten with vegetables and berries. After a night of nature's quick freeze, the entire muskox was harder than a brick. Today, they were to return to Norvik. Due to Agnes's snowmobile malfunctioning after a coolant leak and subsequent issues, they had to use one snowmobile to transport the meat and tow the broken one back. This journey home was a 150-kilometer trek across the frozen tundra. To lighten the load on the front vehicle, Chip removed the belt from the broken snowmobile, allowing it to glide in neutral. They also left extra fuel in the tent behind, planning to return here to spend the summer. They had hoped to trap some fur animals, but the broken snowmobile and the meat harvest, coupled with 5 daughters waiting at home, signaled it was time to head back. They hoped the return journey would be without incident. After several hours, they reached a cabin, their midway supply station, marking half the journey. Chip refueled the snowmobile, which had consumed more fuel than expected and moved slower than planned. He prayed the engine would hold up after hours of driving in Arctic conditions, which had numbed them completely. They entered the cabin to warm up with hot coffee and give the snowmobile a rest. After a brief break, they prepared to set off again, with 3 hours of daylight left, hoping to reach home before sunset. The journey would be easier once they left the uneven tundra for the smoother ice-covered river. However, after several rough patches, the towed snowmobile overturned. Agnes quickly signaled Chip to stop, and they checked the damage. There was no major issue, except the windshield was shattered, adding to the snowmobile's woes. With no better option, they had to drag it back anyway. Alone on the frozen tundra, they had to solve all problems by themselves. As the sun neared the horizon, Chip and Agnes hurried along, knowing the dangers of traveling at night on such rough terrain. For them, a broken snowmobile was better than returning home without meat. As the last traces of dusk faded, they finally returned to their community. Their daughters, excited to hear about the muskox, looked forward to fresh heart and tongue. With the moon in the sky, Chip prepared soup with carrots, heart, and tongue, while Agnes played cards with the daughters. Once the cooking was nearly done, they sliced the heart and tongue, gathering around to enjoy the delicious meal, a perfect blend of meat and vegetables. Kutan especially relished her pot of hot soup, thoroughly enjoying her meal. The next day, Agnes and her 2 daughters prepared to head to a new campsite. Besides essential survival supplies, they planned to go ice fishing, a skill Agnes learned from her parents during her childhood. Chip brought some traps to catch fur-bearing animals. The family of 4 set off on their snowmobiles, arriving at the cabin by nightfall. On the way there, Chip spotted a moose carcass near the riverbank. Such sites often attract fur-bearing animals looking for food. Agnes and the daughters took care of setting up camp while Chip drove alone to the location of the moose remains. It was unclear whether the moose had been killed by wolves or had drowned, but its body was partially frozen in the river. Chip set 2 traps there, hoping to catch some fur-bearing animals. The next day, he drilled several holes in the ice, and the family of 4 sat down to fish. Hours passed without a single catch, and the wind grew colder and stronger. Before it got dark, Chip rode his snowmobile to check the traps he had set the night before. One had been triggered, but it hadn't caught anything. The strong winds that night were expected to reach 9 to 10 on the scale, potentially burying the moose carcass under an additional 30 to 50 centimeters of snow, rendering the traps useless. Agnes and the daughters also came back empty-handed, making the ice fishing trip seem fruitless. Every year at this time, Chip and Agnes would visit their winter hunting ground. What was different this year was that Chip could also use antique weapons. He took out a 5mm Hawken rifle, poured some black powder into it, and forcefully struck the ramrod to compact the powder. Today, he planned to hunt musk ox with this old weapon, a challenge as daunting as using a melee weapon like Roland the Great. Years ago, Chip had been given a suspended sentence for a felony after providing a false alibi for a friend in a non-violent crime, which restricted him from using modern firearms. Over time, he was allowed to use pre-1898 manufactured firearms. However, after several attempts, the old gun failed to fire, proving unreliable. Fortunately, he had brought a backup weapon that could fire successfully, but it lacked rifling, so he had to be very close to the game to have a chance of success. Then the 2 set off on their snowmobile. Musk oxen usually gather in herds in the western mountainous region of Kivalina to avoid the cold and strong winds of winter. These creatures, about the size of a male reindeer, can produce twice the amount of meat as reindeer. Chip and Carol parked their snowmobile on a hillside, spotting a group of dark figures in the distance. Chip used binoculars to confirm, but the distance and visibility made it hard to distinguish whether they were reindeer or musk oxen. Only after Agnes looked did they confirm it was a herd of musk oxen. Approaching the herd in such an open area without cover was unlikely, as they were too far away and out of shooting range. Consequently, Chip and Carol had to drive to Deering to repair his malfunctioning weapon. Musk oxen, unstartled, do not move quickly, so their tracks would still be visible upon their return. In Deering, they quickly found Jerry, a well-known gunsmith in the area skilled at repairing antique rifles. After explaining the problem, Chip dismantled the weapon. They cleaned every part and discovered that the lubricant at the bottom of the barrel had frozen. After replacing it with antifreeze lubricant, the rifle seemed ready. Outside, the rifle fired without a hitch. If Chip could get within 100 meters of the musk oxen, there was a good chance of success. They hurried back to where they had seen the herd, which hadn't moved far from the mountaintop. Chip donned a white camouflage suit to approach discreetly. When threatened, musk oxen form a circle to protect the cows and calves. They didn't see Chip as a threat, even as he got close. Chip didn't hesitate. He crouched, aimed, and fired, hitting one of the musk oxen. He signaled Agnes to bring the snowmobile closer. Such powerful animals are hard to bring down with one shot, so they followed slowly, waiting for the injured musk ox to lag behind before firing again. Chip removed his white jacket to apply pressure to the herd, as musk oxen, like other herd animals, look out for each other. It was possible to chase them all day. Seizing the opportunity, Chip fired again. The injured muskox staggered a few steps before collapsing. It was one of the larger ones in the herd, with long fur and plenty of fat. They began butchering the animal, undeterred by the cold, windy weather. The joy of the hunt warmed them. Spotting and harvesting a muskox in previous years was rare. This catch could yield about 250 to 260 kilograms of beef, along with a muskox hide and head. After cleaning the innards, they loaded the sled. Instead of heading home immediately, they decided to first deliver some meat to Jerry as a thank you for his help. Fresh ingredients often just need simple boiling to be enjoyed. Sharing the experience of obtaining food with village elders is a joyful occasion. Enjoying a meal where the meat is fatty yet not greasy, lean yet not tough, signifies a good day. But today was special because it was musk ox meat they were eating. The next day, Chip took a can of gasoline and set out to perform a comprehensive check on the snowmobile. His method of fueling was somewhat wasteful, as the spills could have fueled the snowmobile for a couple of miles. In winter, the snowmobile was their only means of transportation, so maintaining it in good working condition was crucial. After inspecting the chassis and the belt, which were fine, He took it for a test drive. The frozen river served like a highway, and Chip could speed up to 80 miles per hour, covering 20 to 30 kilometers without any issues. Meanwhile, at home, Agnes and her eldest daughter, Timok, were making coats from the fur they had gathered. For the Hailstone family, using captured fur for clothing was a tradition and key to surviving the harsh winters. They sketched the rough shape of the coat on the prepared fur, which was actually gray wolf skin. A coat required at least 3 wolf pelts to complete. According to Agnes, nearly every Inuit woman owned a coat made of wolverine fur. They had only one piece of wolverine fur, but plenty of wolf pelts, so Agnes planned to use the wolf fur as the main material and the wolverine fur for trim and decoration. Coats made from these materials could keep them warm even in temperatures as low as -50 degrees Celsius. They cut the fur along the sketched lines with a small knife, constantly trying it on to avoid any mistakes with such valuable material. After cutting the desired pieces, sewing began. High-quality fur often required only basic stitching techniques, but the entire process could take several hours. Agnes taught her daughter various stitching techniques she had learned from her mother, and now they could manage on their own. To ensure better sewing, the fur's hair was initially placed inside. Once everything was set correctly, they turned it right side out. While Chip was out test driving the snowmobile and bringing back some firewood, Agnes came over wearing the homemade wolf fur coat, which looked as luxurious as any high-end brand. Interestingly, wearing it felt like instantly gaining 200 pounds, and from a distance, one might mistake her for a brown bear due to the hat. But in terms of warmth, it was unquestionably effective. Early in the morning, Chip and Agnes were busy clearing snow from a luxurious cabin that they planned to move to a new site. Before they could transport it, they had to dismantle the roof to prevent the structure from becoming top-heavy and potentially falling apart during the move. If not for their dog, restrained by a chain, who could have contributed a bit to the effort, the task was left entirely to the Hailstone family. Each member took a corner, lifting off the roof and then breaking it down into 3 pieces for easier transport. Before reaching the river, they used 2 snowmobiles to tow the cabin. Towing such a load was quite easy for the snowmobiles. Once on the river, which acted like a highway due to the ice, Chip took over the towing with 1 snowmobile for better maneuverability and control. The 2 sped along the river, one leading and the other following, transporting the large cabin more smoothly than anticipated. However, an incident occurred. Agnes's snowmobile developed a coolant leak. Chip, unaware, continued forward, leaving Agnes staring in dismay on the ice. It wasn't until he had traveled a few kilometers that he returned to her location. Unable to repair the snowmobile in the wilderness, they decided to leave it there temporarily, while they continued to transport the cabin to its destination. By the afternoon, they had reached the destination, but they still needed to transport the roof and complete the assembly. They also planned to bring back the broken snowmobile on their return journey. The round trip of 60 kilometers took a full day. The next day, Chip and Agnes set out from Norvik with the cabin's roof, arriving at their destination by late morning. They quickly reassembled the cabin to its original form, aiming to make it habitable by nightfall. The most challenging part was repositioning the roof. They used levers to lift the roof onto the structure and then slid it into place, also securing the surrounding area with canvas for wind and rain protection. The final step was to move the cabin onto the foundation they had prepared in the autumn, which was now buried under snow. Fortunately, the snow formed a natural slope. They secured straps to nearby bushes as anchor points and gradually pulled the cabin forward with a winch. Each tightening of the winch moved the cabin closer to its correct position. After positioning and securing the last pieces of canvas, the long-term residence was established. Since they did not have a heating stove installed yet, they could not stay overnight in the cabin just then. Early in the morning, Chip and Agnes were butchering a deer thigh. Their 4th and 5th children drove home on an ATV after school, bringing back the family's mail. The Hailstone family lives in Norvik, Alaska. Their 2 sons have already moved out, leaving only their 5 daughters at home. Agnes is a full Inuit and a native Alaskan. They spend the entire year hunting, fishing, and gathering food. The mail brought by their 4th child included a deed from Agnes's parents, detailing the exact location of the property by river and land coordinates. Moreover, the land has permanent usage rights, allowing legal inheritance by their children. Joe, their youngest son, happened to be passing by, so the 3 decided to take a boat to explore the new land and let him choose a spot for his homestead. In addition, they planned to build a permanent residence on their own land. After arriving, they found that the land on both sides of the river belonged to Agnes. They walked along the riverbank looking for a suitable place to set up camp, and soon found several wooden stakes left from a previous tent setup, indicating an ideal location. They then went to another river to gather materials for the foundation, finding many fallen, weather-worn trees ready to use without branches or bark. After cutting them into lengths that could be transported by boat, they quickly filled the boat with wood. Back at the homestead, they continued to clear the shrubbery with a chainsaw. For the indigenous people living here, the land is essential for survival. After clearing, they dug deep pits for the foundation and placed the collected logs in them. The foundation needed to be about 60 centimeters high, so any excess was sawed off. Once the beams were placed, the foundation was completed. The next day, Chip prepared materials to build a cabin. He planned to create an oversized sled on which the cabin would be mounted. Once heavy snow arrived, they could tow it with a snowmobile to the prepared foundation. This sled was more like a floor for the house. Chip, Agnes, and their eldest daughter, Timak, flipped the base and added plastic sheets to reduce friction with the ground. Since the river wasn't frozen and there was no snow, Agnes and Timak went fishing instead. They secured one end of a fishing net with stakes and towed the other into the middle of the river by boat. Within minutes, they caught their first white salmon of the day. The net would stay in place for a while. The next day, they returned to check the net and saw ripples from the fish inside. It looked like another bountiful day. They quickly began to retrieve the net, pulling up 4 to 5 fish from the same spot. Besides the white salmon filled with roe, there were also a few red salmon. Despite the cold weather, the joy of the catch warmed their hearts. One fish was too rotten to eat as it had spawned. They returned home with several large basins full of fish. At home, Chip had completed the cabin's framework. Once the ground froze, they could tow it to the right spot. Next, they enjoyed a meal of freshly baked white salmon, served simple to highlight its natural flavor, accompanied by dried reindeer meat and bread. The Hailstone family gathered around the table, relishing the self-sufficiency. The roe-filled white salmon nearly moved Kutan to tears. Once winter set in, fresh white salmon would have to wait until next year. In the snowy town of Norvik, Chip and Carol went out to collect some willow branches. The snow-covered ground made it the perfect time to set traps for catching wild rabbits, and it was also a good opportunity to teach his daughter some hunting skills. Collecting willow is not difficult, but care must be taken not to poke one's eyes with the branches. Willow is chosen for trap making because the local rabbits feed on willow bark. Setting snares on these branches helps the traps blend in with the environment. After collecting a bundle of willow branches, the two prepared to head back. Rabbits rarely venture out during blizzards, but they emerge to make paths once the storm subsides. Like many animals, rabbits tend to follow the same routes. To set the snare, they wrapped one end of the wire around the willow branch 2.5 times and fashioned the other end into a slip knot. The key to snare placement is the height. Too high, and the rabbit escapes. Too low, and it might catch the foot instead. Carol watched intently, and then started making her own snares. They made 35 in total, unsure how many rabbits would be caught. Once the storm stopped, Chip and Carol moved along the river, planning to lay a 3-kilometer line of traps. They were quickly drawn to tracks in the snow and set a snare in the bushes beside the path, using 2 sticks to guide the rabbits into the trap. When the rabbits passed by again, they would hopefully catch some. After setting up the spot, they continued forward, placing a trap wherever they found footprints. Every year when the river freezes, the Hailstone family engages in this activity. Whether they get to enjoy fresh roasted rabbit depends on their luck. Early the next morning, the two rode their snowmobile to check the traps they had set the day before. The traps were placed along the sides of the road, making it easy to see if they had caught anything. The first trap was empty, but the second had caught a rabbit. However, the rabbit was still alive, not caught by the neck. Chip, unfazed, quickly and efficiently broke its neck. The next trap had caught something, but a fox had gotten there first, leaving behind only traces of blood and rabbit fur. It appeared the rabbit had been stolen last night. The two rushed to check the remaining traps. Those without a catch were left in place, as they still had potential if checked regularly. Another trap yielded a rabbit, already frozen stiff, likely caught earlier in the night. Carol now knew how to catch rabbits too. She could ride the snowmobile to set her own traps, and eventually, she could teach these hunting skills to her children. The remaining traps were empty, but 2 rabbits were enough for dinner. They roasted the rabbits until crispy on the outside and tender inside, looking delicious. The youngest daughter, Kutan, eagerly grabbed a rabbit leg, enjoying the lean yet tender meat. Like most animals after summer, the rabbits were plump and tasty. Now, at the onset of winter, was the best time to catch them. Today's 2 rabbits were just the beginning, and they hoped to catch more in the future. In the early morning, Glenn prepared to leave, carrying his luggage and a shotgun. Summer is the best time for camping in Alaska, but it's also when mosquitoes are most rampant, especially near water sources. Since acquiring a canoe, Glenn had explored the 8-kilometer area around the lake. He was eager to see more distant places, starting with paddling to the first mountain peak. Having climbed the surrounding ridges repeatedly, he found them uninteresting. His destination lay beyond the mountains, and the canoe served to help him cross the lake in front of his door. The rest of the journey would rely on his legs. Glenn's first summer here had seen him climb the mountain at his feet, drawn by the taller peaks opposite, though the distance had always deterred him. The only feasible time to visit was during summer. Reaching the river at the mountain base, he faced uncharted territory and cautiously chose the narrowest crossing point. His revolver and clothes were packed into a waterproof bag before he prepared to cross the river naked. The water appeared shallow, but its swift current could easily sweep a person away. Fortunately, Glenn grabbed onto some riverside vegetation and climbed up. After dressing, he set off for the next mountain, which rose 2,100 meters high. To reach the highest peak, he needed to climb 1,500 meters vertically and then walk about 11 kilometers along the ridge. Glenn preferred walking barefoot in the wetlands, picking blueberries along the way. However, the presence of wild berries often indicated bears nearby. Spotting bear droppings, he lost his appetite for blueberries, fearing he might become an easy snack for a brown bear. Upon finally reaching the mountain base, he found the valley weather unpredictable. One moment it was sunny, and the next, clouds gathered ominously, signaling an approaching storm. Glenn quickly donned his raincoat, undeterred by the worsening weather and his passion for climbing. In steeper sections, he climbed using both hands and feet. The highest peak in the distance was his goal, still 7 or 8 kilometers away. Most of the path on the summit was rocky, prompting him to put on boots from his bag and continue towards the highest peak along the ridge. Here, he could enjoy the scenery without the annoyance of swarming mosquitoes. The distant sky displayed a trace of evening glow, though it was already midnight. Alaskan summers can have up to 22 hours of daylight. Here, Glenn would eat when hungry and sleep when tired. He couldn't recall how many hours he had walked today, only feeling tired and ready to rest. So, he pitched his tent to sleep before continuing to the highest peak in the morning. Upon waking, the mountaintop was shrouded in thick fog. It only began to clear when the sunlight hit the ridge. The peak Glenn intended to summit was still enveloped in clouds, but he expected them to dissipate by the time he got there. Seeing the grandeur of the mountains made him realize how insignificant humans are in the vastness of nature. Reaching the base of the highest peak marked the final sprint. If the weather were bad, it would be easy to lose one's way on such peaks, as the clouds obscure all visibility. Glenn enjoyed outdoor activities not only for the beautiful wilderness views, but also to appreciate the force of nature. The last part of the journey was all rocky terrain, arguably the toughest section of the climb. The visible paths here were made by mountain goats. With the summit in sight, Glenn began to cheer. Standing at the top felt incredible, a sense of dominance that perhaps only those who have climbed know. From here, his camp was only 32 kilometers away, but the journey involved crossing several rivers and climbing over mountains. The Brooks Range stretched endlessly, with the peak beneath his feet being the highest. There were no signs of human visitation. Perhaps no one had ever been here before. Glenn decided to leave a marker, possibly for future visitors to recognize that someone shared their thoughts. For 15 years, Glenn had wanted to climb this peak, and he succeeded this summer. The mountains, lakes, and valleys had formed over tens of thousands of years. Human life is but a few decades. One should step into nature to experience and become part of it. Early in the morning, Glenn was loading his shotgun with shells. He wasn't preparing for hunting today, but for personal safety while walking through the forest. Despite the beautiful flowers around his house, it's a dangerous area with many wild animals. Years ago, Glenn built a shelter on the mountain for hunting goats and to conceal himself. Winter storms and snow often bury the shelter, requiring maintenance to prepare for fall goat hunting. Glenn set off along the lakeshore towards the distant mountains. Entering the forest, he encountered a strikingly beautiful blue flower known as aconite, which is highly poisonous. Eating this plant by mistake could be fatal. In wilderness survival, it's best not to touch unknown plants. While large predators can be guarded against in the summer woods, mosquitoes are a relentless nuisance, attacking anything that moves. Glenn put on a long-sleeved shirt to protect himself and continued towards the mountains. Along the way, he found a large patch of ripe blueberries, the first wild fruit to mature here each summer. Following the principle of not passing up free food, he began picking them, quickly gathering a large bowlful. Now, with berries collected, Glenn needed to carry water up the mountain, as finding it higher up could be challenging. Walking along a dry riverbed for a few minutes, he heard running water but found it too muddy to drink, likely causing sickness if consumed. With no recent rain to explain the mud, Glenn had to look elsewhere. Fortunately, he found a clear stream at the base of the mountain with pebbles all around, where he drank heartily from the clean, sweet water. After quenching his thirst, Glenn started his ascent. As he climbed higher, the calorie expenditure increased, but the advantage was the absence of mosquitoes. 10 years ago, Glenn built a stone shelter here. Many of its rocks had since collapsed. The site provided an excellent view, making it easy to spot goats passing below, much like the group visible a few kilometers away. Visibility is a double-edged sword, as prey can see you too, which is why he built the shelter. After a tough climb, it was natural to camp here overnight to avoid unwelcome intruders, keeping his shotgun ready. After a night's rest, Glenn began repairing the stone shelter. He moved every usable rock to the summit, quickly accumulating a pile of flat stones. Using their weight, he leaned them against each other, placing them strategically to provide concealment during hunting and to block the mountain winds. By late morning, Glenn had finished repairing the shelter. These mountains have remained unchanged since their formation, never developed, and many areas untouched by humans. Alaska remains one of the few undeveloped natural areas, possibly the last sanctuary for those yearning for freedom. With the final stone in place, the repair was complete. Here, not only could Glenn enjoy the scenery, but he could also hunt for meat to last through the winter. He planned to return here during the hunting season to capture the tasty wild goats. When the lake water began to flow, Glenn went out to look for fresh protein. Fish from the deep waters during winter would now approach the flowing outlets, and ducks would settle in the thawed riverbanks. Many animals lived in his backyard. A pair of eagles had been there since Glenn moved in 16 years ago and returned every spring to raise 1 or 2 chicks. Nothing could be better than having the king of the sky as a neighbor. After the snow melted, many wild fruits reappeared on the ground, and the forest revitalized. Glenn picked up a juniper berry, known for its strong flavor, and liked to keep a few in his mouth for revitalization. He continued to a river, adhering to the fisherman's rule that wherever there is water, one should cast a line. Glenn quickly set up his fishing gear and cast it into the water, evenly retrieving the line. Despite several attempts, he caught nothing and had to keep moving downstream to a log bridge he had built 2 years ago. Under the chatter of squirrels, he reached a bend in the river, a favorite spot for large Arctic grayling to feed. Glenn cast his rod with a lure and immediately got a bite on the first try. He quickly pulled the fish ashore, marking his first catch of the year. He cast again, seeing a large fish chase the lure, but it refused to bite. Deciding not to waste more time, Glenn focused on his real target, the wild ducks in the pond. After climbing a slope, a large thawed lake appeared before him. To avoid startling the prey, Glenn first used binoculars to survey the area. He spotted a beautiful male duck on the ice and a female duck swimming nearby. He approached the shore, but didn't rush his shot due to unfavorable wind directions, which could blow his prey away. Just then, he noticed a solitary duck under a tree branch. Not wanting to miss the opportunity, he raised his shotgun and fired. The duck was hit instantly. Sometimes choosing the right target made hunting much easier. Patience was often necessary for hunting. The duck was a red-necked phalarope, typically feeding on aquatic vegetation and roots, tastier than those feeding on small fish and shrimp. With his catch in hand, Glenn returned home to cook dinner. The duck was pan-fried, and the grayling was braised. Both met in the bowl, creating a rich dinner. Eager to taste, Glenn cut a piece and enjoyed the tender, nutritious meat while admiring the beautiful sunset. Glenn watched the thawing waters with eager anticipation. Naturally inclined to action, he stood shirtless on the lakeshore, took a deep breath, and walked straight into the ice melt area. At this time of year, the water temperature hovered around 0 degrees Celsius. Typically, entering such cold water could cause hypothermia within 15 minutes. But Glenn was not an ordinary person. Known as the Wilderness Bathing King, he had been training his endurance and willpower, gradually acclimating his body to the cold environment. Spending even a few minutes in ice water is a life-saving skill at critical moments. Glenn believed human potential was incredible. By focusing mental energy, one could achieve extraordinary feats. Each time he entered the water, he pushed his body to the limit, staying as long as possible. After getting out, he would immediately warm up inside his house. Today, however, he was not satisfied with his performance. Despite the air temperature being around 10 degrees Celsius, he was still shivering. There were 2 reasons he trained his body to withstand the cold. One was to better cope with the 9 months of harsh winter, and the other was to retrieve his canoe via water route. He had left it in the forest across the lake 3 years ago after its last use. Walking overland would take him around several kilometers, but based on his physical condition today, taking a shortcut through the water seemed implausible. Half an hour after getting out of the water, Glenn's body had still not recovered. He had no choice but to wrap himself in his fur coat. Although he was frozen stiff, he stubbornly claimed he could have stayed in the water even longer mentally. After recovering, Glenn still chose to travel overland to the wilderness because he lacked a map and compass and didn't know the exact location of his canoe. He had to rely on his memory, using the sun, mountains, and rivers as his navigation aids. As the saying goes, the higher you stand, the further you see. Glenn climbed a nearby hill where he could view the entire valley and clearly see where he had left the canoe 3 years ago. Once he confirmed the canoe's location, he didn't rush to descend. Besides enjoying the valley's scenery, he also planned his hunting route. On foot, he could cover only a few kilometers in a day, but with the canoe, traveling 100 kilometers wasn't out of the question. When he reached the bottom of the mountain, a muddy river blocked his path. The river was wide, and learning from his previous experience, Glenn didn't rush to cross it. Instead, he set up his tent nearby to rest. For a summer day with 20 hours of daylight, he woke up to find the sun still high in the sky. He found a spot where the water flowed more slowly, ready to cross. He stored his clothes in a waterproof bag in his backpack and then plunged into the cold river, swimming vigorously toward the opposite shore. Once ashore, he quickly changed into dry clothes and gathered some dry branches to start a fire, preventing hypothermia. With the warmth of the flames, every part of his body returned to normal function. Glenn then continued his journey to find the canoe. He remembered leaving it in this part of the forest. After a few minutes of walking through the dense woods, he finally saw the long-awaited canoe. After inspecting it and seeing no major issues, he dragged it to the riverbank. At that moment, Glenn was thrilled. With the canoe, the fish in the lake would have their days numbered, and when he wanted to eat wild duck, he wouldn't have to worry about whether he could retrieve it. Glenn paddled his canoe along the river. In winter, his diet mainly consisted of moose and reindeer, but in summer it was entirely different, including beaver, dogfish, and wild ducks. As an opportunistic hunter, he believed that anything that flies, other than planes, and anything that walks, other than tables, was fair game for protein. A North American hare appeared in front of him. Glenn quickly steered the canoe to the shore. Sensing danger, the hare didn't run far and hid in the bushes. Despite its perfect hiding, it couldn't escape Glenn's sharp eyes. After firing his gun, he confirmed the hit and pulled a plump rabbit from the forest, securing fresh protein for dinner. He took the rabbit to an open area. In the cooler autumn and winter, food storage was easier, but in spring and summer it was not, so he focused on hunting smaller animals. Glenn skillfully skinned and gutted the rabbit, leaving behind the innards and fur and only taking the meat. Continuing downstream, Glenn was hopeful to spot a couple of ducks among the lush water plants along the bank. While he didn't see any ducks, he did spot a few moose. Unfortunately, it wasn't moose hunting season, and hunting a mother moose with calves was always off limits. Seeing a mother with her young was a joyous sight, indicating a thriving ecosystem. If time allowed, he would sit and watch for hours. But now, he needed to keep moving to track down ducks. Sometimes hunting didn't require seeing the prey first. Often, he heard them. 2 ducks flew out of the bushes, but they were too far to shoot. Glenn continued paddling gently along the shore. The next 2 ducks were not as lucky. They were busy feeding and didn't notice Glenn approaching. He stood up, loaded his gun, aimed and fired just as the ducks realized the danger and tried to fly away. The recoil nearly knocked him out of the canoe, but he successfully shot the ducks in midair. With the canoe, Glenn didn't have to wait for the game to drift ashore. He typically targeted drakes to avoid impacting the population's breeding. After collecting his game, he gratefully acknowledged nature's bounty. This area was new to him, and so far he had harvested both rabbit and duck, and perhaps there would be fish as well. With plenty of food for the day, he decided to find a spot to camp and enjoy his meal. Glenn moored his canoe on a sandbar, chose a flat, dry area near a water source with plenty of dead spruce trees around, ideal for camping. He took out his gear, including an axe, a knife, and a chainsaw, essential tools for wilderness survival. He chopped a few trees, tied them with paracord to create a basic frame, and covered it with branches with leaves to form a natural tent that was moisture-proof and warm. Next came the exciting part, cooking. He used leftover trimmings as a makeshift cooking rack. Hanging a pot over a fire, he took the time to boil water and prepared the rabbit meat, throwing legs and ribs into the pot to stew. After waiting for the meat to separate from the bone, indicating it was perfectly cooked, he enjoyed his rabbit meal by the fire, ending another beautiful day. Glenn was initially planning to sleep in his temporary tent that he had set up before. After several heavy snowfalls, he wasn't sure if the tent had withstood the snow or if it had collapsed. Now with the snow reaching knee depth, he had to wear snowshoes to walk over it. The freshly fallen snow was very soft, making it extremely difficult to walk. Glenn trudged through the snow, one step deep after another, as the long absent sun reappeared over the ridge. After today, the days would start to get longer, signaling the end of the harsh winter. Over the hillside, he could see his previously set-up tent, now buried under thick snow, with some parts collapsed. Glenn took out a shovel to clear the snow around the tent. If he didn't clear and salvage it, the tent would be ruined. After clearing the snow and retying the corners with paracord, the tent was back in usable condition. His task for today was just to ensure the tent was still habitable for future hunting trips without worries. After trekking several kilometers back home in his snowshoes, Glenn noticed his calves were swollen. Walking in the soft snow had put extra strain on his muscles and tendons. He filled a plastic bag with snow for a cold compress to reduce the swelling caused by overuse. The nearest hospital was 320 kilometers away, making a visit there impractical. All Glenn could do was give his body time to recover. After a night of ice treatment, the swelling in his legs had completely subsided. Under the sunshine, the whole forest began to burst with life. Looking at the clear blue sky, Glenn felt rejuvenated and quickly fried 2 venison steaks to help regain his strength. Once fed, Glenn couldn't sit still. He grabbed his snowshoes and set out again. Reindeer typically like to walk along the ridges, so he planned to head to a distant ridge to possibly spot a herd. After a few more hours of trekking, the terrain became too steep for snowshoes, so he left them temporarily to retrieve on his way back. Above the tree line, the snow was deeper, making it feel more like swimming through a sea of snow than climbing a mountain. He had to use his hands and feet to barely make it to the top, where he immediately saw fresh wolf tracks, a good sign for hunting reindeer. Glenn found a snowdrift sheltered from the wind, about 2 meters high. Digging a hole in it would create a natural shelter. He began shoveling snow, and if successful, this snow cave could last until the snow melted. As the sun set, the nighttime temperature would drop to -40 degrees Celsius. Within half an hour, a luxurious snow room was created, albeit a bit cramped, but that didn't matter much now. As the sun went down, Glenn entered the snow cave with his equipment and lit a moose oil lamp. The heat was not enough to melt the snow, but sufficient to ward off the chill. Snuggled in his sleeping bag, he could now sleep soundly. With some luck, he might wake up to a herd of reindeer near the entrance of his cave. The next day, it was already bright outside, but Glenn was still asleep in the dim cave. He used a sleeping bag to keep warm, yet paradoxically, he slept shirtless in the snow cave. Despite the harsh outdoor temperature of -40 degrees Celsius, It remained around 0 degrees inside the cave. The only issue was the constant dripping from above, which Glenn didn't waste. He drank the melted water. After dressing, he headed to the mountaintop. Today there was no sun, just a slight breeze, and unfortunately, the anticipated herd of reindeer did not appear. Although he didn't see his intended prey, he gained a new skill, which was a reason to be happy. With winter soon ending and the forest coming back to life, Glenn just needed to wait patiently. Early in the morning, Glenn pushed open his door and pulled out a whole reindeer that he had hung outside to freeze solid over the past 4 days. Last night, he brought it inside to thaw, and then used a sled to drag it onto the lake surface, preparing to skin it. The reason Glenn froze and then thawed the reindeer was purely to facilitate the removal of its hide. The repeated freezing caused the hide to separate from the body, allowing him to tear off the skin by hand. This reindeer would provide him with food for several weeks, and the hide could be made into a blanket. In the cold winter, deer skin offers excellent insulation. However, beneath the hide, there were many warble fly larvae, which live under the skin. He would need to perform a detailed cleaning later. He easily peeled off the complete hide, which would eventually become a warm blanket on his bed. After tossing the hide aside onto the snow, Glenn proceeded to process the deer meat, cutting it into small pieces to speed up thawing whenever he wanted to eat. A robust buck could last about a month, but this smaller one would only last about half a month. Regardless, none of the game would go to waste. Now, he needed to go back inside to work on the hide. He buried the deer meat in the snow to protect it from birds. Carrying the hide and a deer leg, Glenn headed towards his cabin. He hung the deer leg inside to thaw while he cleaned the remaining fat and fly larvae from the hide. Botflies lay eggs on reindeer hide, which hatch in the warmer summer months. If not cleaned properly, the larvae could reduce the durability of the hide and pose a risk if slept on. This task was somewhat tedious, but necessary to prevent the hide from deteriorating or rotting. Once cleaned, Glenn would use stones to thoroughly smooth the hide until it became soft and elastic. He tested the conversion of the fur into leather by biting it. If the bitten area quickly returned to its original form, it was done. This traditional method has been used for a long time to test leather quality. Now, a finished deer hide was created. Although it wasn't processed as meticulously as old Tom might have done, Glenn successfully turned it into a blanket and was very fond of it, constantly stroking the deer skin. This was the result of his hard work. Early the next morning, Glenn took a shovel and a bucket to the lake to reopen his ice hole, which he had to do every 4 to 5 days. Upon arrival, he discovered something unusual. A pack of wolves had urinated at his water collection spot. Glenn threw his shovel aside. These wolves were becoming too bold, having not been deterred for just 3 days. Many wolf tracks were in the snow nearby. The presence of wolves suggested nearby prey. Sure enough, looking around, he spotted a reindeer herd across the lake. They had eluded him for days, but had now come right to him. Glenn went back to the cabin to change into his gear and put on his snowshoes, ready to catch a reindeer. The entire lake surface was visible, and to avoid being seen by the herd too soon, he chose to approach from the forest. After traveling through the forest, the moss on the snow indicated that the reindeer had been feeding there. Wolf tracks were also present. These predators followed the herds daily. Glenn needed to catch a reindeer before the wolves made their move. His head was covered in frost, but he was still over 300 meters from his prey. To improve his hunting chances, he had to halve this distance. For a quieter approach, Glenn carried his snowshoes and crouched under trees by the lakeshore. There were many targets, but he couldn't find a good opportunity to shoot. The cold forced him to put on his jacket. Just then, the herd moved behind a small island in the lake center, presenting a good opportunity to get closer. Glenn immediately headed towards the island. Upon reaching it and peeking out, the entire herd turned to look in his direction, likely on high alert due to nearby wolves. In a blink, the large group had vanished, leaving only 2 adults and a young one bouncing on the lake surface. He couldn't catch up with them on foot. As they left, Glenn shouted towards the fleeing reindeer, hoping to confuse them and make them stop. Seeing that this didn't work, he prepared his weapon, but ultimately gave up the hunt. He couldn't distinguish which of the 2 adults was the female, and harming her could endanger the calf's survival. Hunting required patience, and not every attempt would result in a catch. Glenn continued along the lake shore looking for the herd. Suddenly, he noticed bits of reindeer fur in the snow, clearly left by wolves feeding nearby. As he spoke, a gray wolf stood not far from him. Glenn ran towards it, confusing the wolf. Then, he mimicked a wolf howl, piquing its interest. Glenn believed in giving wolves and bears a chance to leave peacefully before resorting to force. Fortunately, after a brief negotiation, the wolf took his advice and left. Although he saw the reindeer herd on the lake today, his hunting luck was just a bit off. Sometimes, not catching prey isn't necessarily bad. With patience, the right opportunity will eventually come. Glenn was sharpening his axe early in the morning. The temperature in his area had dropped to -45 degrees Celsius, requiring him to use much more firewood than usual. In just 1 week, he had used up a third of his stored wood, leaving only enough for 2 more weeks of warmth. Today he planned to gather more. After a heavy snowfall, the forest looked like a snowy wonderland. Over the years, Glenn had chopped all the dead wood around his cabin. Now, he had to go 400 meters away to collect firewood. He didn't mind the time. He actually enjoyed walking through the quiet forest. A half-fallen dead tree appeared in front of him. Glenn cleared the snow off it. The tree was not only large but also very dry, enough to burn for a long time. He began chopping at the tree with great effort. Felling such fallen trees is riskier than cutting standing ones, because it's hard to predict which direction they will fall. To prevent the tree from sliding towards him, Glenn struck it hard with his axe, then quickly moved away. The tree fell along with a shower of snowflakes. Chopping trees alone in the wilderness is risky, but this large tree was worth the risk. Next, he cleaned the branches and cut the trunk into sled-friendly lengths. Normally, Glenn would drag such a large piece of dead wood directly back to his cabin. Today, however, the wood was too heavy and the snow too deep. He had to climb a slope to reach his cabin, so he split the wood into halves on the spot using a wedge. The wood split easily, and one half was enough to last him a day. To prevent slipping on the slope, Glenn used his snowshoes as trekking poles for traction. While many people burn calories on a treadmill, Glenn said he preferred dragging a log up a slope for exercise. He returned to the cabin with the wood, but several more trips were needed to transport it all. In total, he made 10 trips, covering about 8 kilometers with the heavy load. But his work wasn't done yet. The logs were too large to fit into the fireplace. They had to be split into smaller pieces to be used for heating. The cold made the wood brittle, eliminating the need for a saw. Just a swing of the axe was enough to break it. Glenn's 2 favorite activities in the wilderness were chopping wood and bathing. Each time he chopped wood, he felt he had endless energy. Watching the logs split one by one was very stress-relieving and enjoyable. It allowed him to release all his strength, and in no time, the entire dead tree was turned into firewood. Still feeling enthusiastic, Glenn took some pieces inside. After a busy day, he had a great appetite. Tonight, he planned to bake bread for himself. Although there was no oven in the wilderness, Glenn could bake bread using iron pots. He poured some flour into a bowl, added salt and yeast, and mixed it with warm water to form a dough. For soft bread, the fermentation time had to be just right. Glenn placed the dough in an iron pot and set it above the fireplace where warm air currents would speed up the fermentation. After waiting a while, the dough rose and filled the pot. Then, it was more steamed than baked, due to the high temperature and steam, which took about 40 to 50 minutes. Soon, the pot emitted a strong aroma. Glenn was very satisfied with his bread. He cut a slice, topped it with camel fat as a butter substitute, and took a bite. It was an unprecedented satisfaction, especially after a day's physical labor. Nothing was more enjoyable than enjoying a greasy slice of bread. When the sunlight hits the Brooks Range, Glenn steps out of his cabin with his weapon. Each time he goes hunting, he likes to stand by the lake and observe the surrounding ridges. Today he spotted a herd of deer on a nearby mountain. Sometimes he might not see them for a year, but today he saw hundreds of reindeer. The movements of these herds are unpredictable, and they might be gone by tomorrow. Naturally, Glenn decided to try and catch one. Half of his meat supply each year comes from these animals, and now the herd was moving down the mountainside, presenting a rare opportunity. Glenn prepared to head to the forest, where the reindeer were passing through. After hurrying along, he finally spotted them in the forest. The antlers on one deer indicated it was a very robust buck. Glenn raised his weapon, aimed, and followed the moving target. He could have easily shot this reindeer, but he ultimately decided against it. The buck was in rut, making its fat content low and its meat tough to eat. Glenn preferred to target young bucks, or does without fawns. Most of the herd was feeding above the tree line. Hunting them would require climbing higher ridges, which could take a lot of time. To get deer meat, he had to go where they were. Time passed, and Glenn reached above the tree line, spotting a group of target animals 500 meters away, still out of his shooting range. Risking being spotted, he moved closer. At 200 meters, he set up his weapon and took aim. After a brief moment, he decisively pulled the trigger. A young buck fell into the snow with a loud noise. Today, Glenn hadn't brought a sled. Transporting the game back would take a considerable amount of time. He approached the reindeer, took out a knife, and began gutting it. The deer's fur was very fluffy. Glenn decided not to skin it right away because the fur could protect the meat during transport. Sometimes getting the hunted game home is harder than the hunt itself, especially without a sled. The thick snow and steep terrain made the journey challenging. It took Glenn several hours to reach the flat surface of the lake, and he finally got back to the cabin before sunset, relieved to have brought the game home. He hung the reindeer upside down from the cabin's beams using a rope. Fortunately, this game wasn't too large. Otherwise, he wouldn't have been able to drag it back by hand. Glenn grew fonder of the deer skin the more he looked at it. After each hunt, he prepared a large meal to reward himself. Unlike other wilderness hunters, Glenn ate some of the liver and kidneys to maintain his body heat. Apart from the intestines and stomach, which he didn't eat, he didn't waste any other organs. After frying them briefly, he added some rice and stirred it. Normally, he wouldn't spare flour and rice, but with fresh ingredients, he used them to enhance his meal. Sitting inside the cabin, Glenn enjoyed the fresh deer meat while looking at the distant ridge where the reindeer herd was. Just a few hours ago, the meat in his bowl was still roaming across the ridge opposite, and now it was in his mouth. This feeling of satisfaction from his efforts was always extraordinary,